With the final shape, players were given new toys to play with in the form of Prismatic and new exotics. These quickly rose to the top charts as the most used in the game. In fact, the Prismatic subclasses dominate usage rates so thoroughly that even the decidedly worst Prismatic class, Titan, is beating the next two non-Prismatic classes of Dawnblade and Nightstalker combined. Ask any player what their best build is, and they will undoubtedly say that it's a Prismatic build. Safe to say, Prismatic is more than just a new and exciting thing. It's good, really good, perhaps too good. Destiny is a very large game, and while it's natural for some things to have updated and more meta-relevant versions of themselves, exotics and subclasses are meant to be always relevant, at least in some capacity. They are unique, one-of-a-kind tools designed to create variety, playstyle, and identity. And if Destiny truly wants to be an inviting and at least somewhat fair game to both free-to-play and the $800 veterans like myself, the balance between old and new must be maintained for their sakes too. Destiny is at its best when many things are viable, not just a handful. The final shape introduced an imbalance. This imbalance is fun for a season, but not for the rest of Destiny's lifespan. Unfortunately, Bungie's history dictates that this may be difficult, if not impossible, to resolve so that everyone is happy. But this video will examine some ideas on how to fix the power creep problem. Prismatic is meant to be the portrait of the Guardians' peak power, a collection of every facet of their identities combined into one multi-purpose lore-accurate class. Clearly, Prismatic is meant to be the sort of jack of all trades and master of none. But perhaps in an effort to make sure this shiny new subclass was able to sell DLC copies, Bungie gave each Prismatic class far more powerful tools than they likely should have been available. It may be argued that Prismatic should be the class everyone picks, not just because it's new, but because of its multi-class representation, but it's unlikely that those arguments are truly believed even by the ones that are making them. For example, if you wanted to create a golden gun hunter, the one that you're seeing all your friends use, your best pick isn't the gunslinger, it's Prismatic Hunter. Prismatic Hunter has far more utility than could ever be offered by the Solar Hunter. While Solar does have other unique things it can offer, it is massively outshined. Right now, picking anything other than the Prismatic version of Hunter is less than optimal. Being less than optimal is not fun. All classes should be competitive with one another, not just the latest updated class. We wouldn't want to throw away a literal decade of memories and builds, right? Unfortunately, however, every option available to you for your supers are some of the best hunters have to offer. Their aspects may seem conflicting, but in reality, they write a blank check for many of the best parts of the hunter kits. The worst super available here is likely Storm's Edge, and that is only in the context of PvE, because in PvP, Storm's Edge is the strongest super in the game by a wide mile. But this isn't just a hunter problem. Warlocks are in the exact same position. Besides the limited options available through the Darkness supers, the Warlock's Cataclysm Nova is their best damage option available from Void. Song of Flame was included likely again because of its newness, but it too is incredible in both PvP and PvE. And the only stinker here is Stormtrance, but Chaos Rage doesn't fare too much better. The same goes for their aspects. Bleak Watcher was, for many, the main reason to take Stasis Warlock into PvE. Weaver's Call got a buff and likely was picked over Mindspun Evocation purely because its inputs overlapped. Lightning Surge obliterates other Arc Warlock aspects both for fun factor and for power. Feed the Void gives Devour, which is one of, if not one of the strongest subclass buffs in the game. And Hellion might not be as good as Heat Rises, but again, this was likely included because of its newness. In the previous video, we talked about Titan's power problems compared to the other classes, so to spare us from hashing over all the details again, we can simply refer back to this chart to see that even Prismatic Titans are clearly outperforming other older options. The best version of the class you grew up in love with in Destiny 2 is probably on Prismatic. Prismatic also receives far more options for fragments, and strangely, far more fragment slots. It is the best, and not just by a little bit. It is becoming a black hole where all other subclass options are sucked into and cannot escape unless one were to intentionally play a less than ideally picked class. We have continued to get stronger and stronger and stronger. Prismatic is just simply the manifestation of all of that power creep. This has created a feedback loop of Bungie dialing up difficulty in order to keep the game interesting. No one likes to feel weaker, but isn't a nerf the same thing as making everything opposing you stronger? Rather, if our power level is too inflated, it simply becomes an arms race between players, their builds, and Bungie's difficulty curve. And as things get harder, the less than optimal picks, without a niche to fill, will become comparatively weaker. There aren't 6 subclasses. There is 1. Of course, you can run a single element subclass, but why would you? What can they offer you that you can't get on Prismatic? And to make sure that all sources of doubt are erased, Prismatic also gives access to Transcendence. Transcendence operates as effectively a mini super, providing excellent crowd control, decent damage resistance, and damage bonuses. And Prismatic also gets 2 exotic perks at once via their exotic class items. These perks are from a limited pool and have slightly reduced functionality, of course, but a vast majority of these perks are currently meta-defining. Because the exotic class items offer 2 perks at once, with many of them just being as potent or potentially more powerful than the base exotic, every exotic included has been, in some capacity, power crept. So again, we ask ourselves, why not run Prismatic? By choosing anything other than Prismatic, you are actively choosing a weaker option, according to player statistics, 70% of the time. Look at it this way, 5, 6, or 83% of all subclass options are used currently 30% of the time since Prismatic was released. And unlike Stasis or Strand, this usage doesn't look like it will ever taper off. How could it? Nerfing Prismatic could collaterally nerf the very classes that they came from. And to be clear, this isn't to say that Prismatic should be bad or made worse. Again, the game is at its best when all options are given some room to shine. But what this does say is that Prismatic might be an insolvable puzzle of balance such that it will always remain on top until the heat death of the Destiny universe. But again, is this a bad thing? Doesn't it make sense for our Guardian to be more powerful? No, not for the free-to-play players, and not for you. Free-to-plays are given the pressure from that 70% usage rate to spend their money on Destiny. It's of course natural for a game to weight itself towards the paid players, but there's a limit. This limit is going to where the label of free-to-play might be charitably an exaggeration of the truth. But even for 10-year veterans like myself, this is very dangerous territory. For example, Prismatic Hunter is currently so dominant in PvP that you could make more than $70,000 a year in US dollars if you were paid $1 for every Prismatic Hunter you saw in PvP in an 8-hour workday. Prismatic isn't simply just new, it's overpowered. If Prismatic continues to push the boundaries of power, Bungie's only response is to either continue to inflate the difficulty in order to maintain challenge, or, in the best case scenario, nerf down the class likely very hard. And the longer we hold on to it, the more it will hurt when it's brought down. While it may be fine for the time being while we still are riding the high of the final shape, this will pass, and we will be left with a one-dimensional meta in PvE and PvP that feels smaller than before the expansion. We'll be left with Prismatic and a small collection of zealots for the single element classes, all that's left. But how does Bungie nerf down Prismatic in a way that allows the other classes room to breathe? In other words, how can Prismatic be nerfed without nerfing the subclasses they were sourced from? Buffs are better than nerfs. Sometimes, however, nerfs are necessary. The solution to solve the gridlock of design and balance that Prismatic has created is twofold. 1, buff up underperforming classes, and 2, better establish Prismatic as the jack of all trades, master of none. Prismatic needs to be nerfed in a way that's different than a direct power decrease. The options provided by Prismatic need to be more restrictive than they currently are to incentivize use of other monochromatic classes. The problem is that players are so high on power right now that these suggestions will not be popular, but I encourage you to at least hear me out and then provide your opinions below. Let's start with the nerfs. First off, either let all classes transcend, or more favorably, make Transcendence harder to get, maybe by requiring Prismatic classes to have their super fully charged first. Currently, Transcendence is practically impossible to not get. It's brainless. If it required more thought to achieve, we could also increase its effectiveness when it is active to make it feel more rewarding. Also, let Transcendence energy be refilled from ally banners. This feels like an easy fix. I don't know why this hasn't happened yet. Next, let's touch on fragments. Many of the Prismatic fragments and aspects are very good and often easier to use, and yet Bungie has given a vast majority of every Prismatic aspect more fragment slots. As a general blanket nerf, these should, at the very least, match the subclasses where they came from, if not be slightly reduced in slots. In general, Bungie gave Prismatic classes some of the best supers in the game for their class, giving players an incredibly small incentive to run the monochromatic classes. Let's go case by case. Hunters. Your supers are incredible, and your aspects are very good too. Obviously, your darkness supers can't change, but the light subclass supers are often what people are using you for. Heck, 3-shot Goldie Prismatic Hunter is soloing the Witness right now, which feels just a little silly. Change 3-shot Goldie to 6-shot Goldie. This is the weaker Goldie, yes, but this, at the very least, lets normal Gunslinger breathe a little bit without completely destroying the Prismatic playstyle. Change Deadfall to be Mobius Quiver. You want the optimal debuff and duration? Run actual Night Stalker. While we're here, please for the love of God, buff Spectral Blades. They're so bad. Arc is perfectly fine. Storm's Edge is good. This super needs a nerf in PvP, but that's a separate topic. Aspects, buff Ascension. Let it only consume half of the dodge charge. Stylus Execution can't be swapped with any of the other aspects available, and with the nerfs to super options, leaving this as a well-rounded neutral game option feels fair. Gunpowder Gamble. Increase its base damage, but require actual solar debuffs, abilities, and weapons to charge it, not just any debuffs and then solar abilities and weapons to charge it. Driving it further into its niche, but rewarding the initial subclass that can do it better. Winter Shroud is perfect, and it fits the Hunter's playstyle well. Nerf Threaded Spectre in PvP, let it grant enemies that destroy it kill-based perks like Rampage and Kill Clip, on top of having it take longer to reach full health instead of popping out, ready to tank a full kill's worth of damage. I am salty, yes. Currently, it's an all reward and no risk aspect. For melee's Combination Blow is the main reason to use Arc Hunter, and it's available on Prismatic. Swap this with Disorientating Blow, and Arc Hunter will feel a little bit more used. Swarm Grenades are too strong in PvP, as is Smoke, but again, kind of a separate issue. Now for a few buffs to the monochromatic hunters. Arc Staff. Increase major and champion damage. This is a dangerous super to use in high-end content. Reward players for using it. Let Tempest Strike regain a portion of melee energy back on kills with this uppercut. Buff Blight Ranger to be the sort of Astrocyte verse for hunters. Let it cause jolt to nearby targets when you blink. Let Shinobu's Vow stun champions intrinsically. Give Lucky Raspberry intrinsic jolt to free up a fragment slot. Gunslinger. Reduce acrobat dodges cooldown. It's already incredibly easy to get Radiance. Just give this a little bit more usability. Already mentioned this earlier, but increase Gunpowder Gamble's damage to make it more worth running. Improve Blade Barrage's base tracking. Without Ember of Beams, the tracking on this is kind of abysmal. Buff Caliban's Hand to work with any throwing knife option, but keep the Scorch to the proximity knife as well as the increased cooldown benefits. Increase the damage buff duration of Ophidia Spathe to give it more use cases. Void Hunters, I believe, to have a pretty well-defined niche, as they still have some place in the meta. Leave them as is. I think the same goes for Strand and Stasis Hunters as well, with perhaps some tweaks needed for damage or debuff durations. Warlocks. Warlocks are strong, but far less so than Hunters. Perhaps this is my Warlock bias speaking, but it seems as though Prismatic Warlocks comparatively are balanced, but they remain too strong simply because of Transcendence being exclusive to Prismatic or exotic class items being ridiculous. Regardless, Storm Trance needs a massive buff. Let it last longer, remove its teleport cost, and give it an increase in damage. That'd be nice too. Cataclysm Nova can be swapped for Vortex, with the overall damage being mostly ineffective, but it does remove part of the ease of access, incentivizing more players to play the true Voidlock. Song of Flame seems to be holding its niche well enough, and it's new, so let Prismatic Warlocks have it. Nerfs, if they do come, will likely hit both. The blanket nerf to aspect slots would likely be enough to tone down Prismatic Warlock in a way that feels a little bit more in line. The subclass generally has longer cooldowns than their monochromatic counterparts, which is likely how it should be, and likely how Bungie will eventually end up nerfing the Prismatic class nerfs when they eventually roll around. As for buffs to the monochromatic classes, Arc Warlock needs a near complete facelift. It's one of the worst subclasses in the game for all activities. Both supers need to deal more damage or last longer, and the only aspect that isn't total cheeks is Lightning Surge, which of course, Prismatic does better. Buff Arc Souls to cause jolting explosions when it gets a kill. Buff Electrostatic Mind to cause grenades to deal increased damage while you're amplified. Solar Warlock is still competitive because its supers are still so good with a neutral game that is hard to compete with. Leave it as is. Void Warlock has Devour and Nova Bombs, keeping it as a viable option, but overcharge grenades feel a bit disappointing at times. Let the Chaos Accelerant overcharge grenades deal more damage to make it a little bit more worthwhile. Both Stasis and Strand Warlocks have fared relatively well, so I think giving these, like all Darkness subclasses for that matter, more super options would be a fantastic update. Titans are the weakest of the Prismatic classes, and by extension, currently, the most balanced. We made another video that was too long talking about how to help Titans, so let's keep this section brief. I think the ideology of making Prismatic a stage for the original subclass's weakest parts is well demonstrated here. Thunder Crash and Fist of Havoc should receive massive buffs and then swapped. T-Crash is the main reason for using Arc Titan alongside Knockout. Both are present on Prismatic. Give Arc Titan a reason to be run, swap this with Fist of Havoc, and again make Fist of Havoc stronger. Dreknir's Lash is cool, but likely Into the Fray would have been a more synergistic option for the Titans kits. But we're here now. For every other change, go see our other video. Class items are also a major problem, with many of the Hunter exotic class items being the leader of the pack. These are also incredibly annoyingly difficult to farm for. So in general, let farming these have a sort of knockout system, or let these drop randomly from all activities, making the grind feel far less narrow and mandatory. In general, the perks that should have been chosen, in my very humble opinion, should have been exotics that are usable by both Prismatic classes, but most importantly, not a direct power creep of other exotics. Currently, if the exotic perk exists on a class item, it is typically just objectively better than its base exotic armor because you get a whole second exotic perk to go with it. Some of these exotic perks are almost impossible to nerf as well. I actually in this video wrote a whole section going over the specifics of each perk and how to change it, but ended up being far too long. So I will just summarize it for now by saying many of the exotic perks currently available probably should not have been an option from the start, or at the very least, the exotic perks that are available should only provide the absolute weakest part of that perk, not the best part. Looking at you, Star Rater Scales. This is all fine, but still, a lot of power fantasy of Destiny comes from weapons. Problematically, the consistently weakest weapons are the oldest weapons. While Bungie has buffed and updated older exotics in the past, many of them have fallen flat. So, while we're tuning Prismatic, let's take a pass on some of the weakest old school exotics in the game and give them one last chance to shine. Destiny has never been perfectly balanced. Perfect balance in any game is a myth. Heck, even chess has metas based on who gets the first move. But many of the worst exotics in Destiny are the oldest exotics. These serve as a textbook example as to how much Destiny has changed over the years, and how bad power creep has gotten. Power level can be crept, but not designed. Certain weapons serve as a benchmark of balance and can sort of clue us in to where power creep has gotten out of hand. I call these weapon anchor exotics. These are exotics that should, no matter what, offer a niche and can never be power crept. One of the cleanest examples of this idea is in the Monte Carlo. Despite many melee-focused perks being created, Monte still stands as a pillar for melee-based builds. Next is Graviton Lance and Sunshot. Both are still highly meta viable, offering fantastic tools for AdClair. Next is Ace of Spades. This might as well be labeled as the Crucible Hand Cannon. If Ace isn't in the top 10, something is very wrong. Next is Rat King. Rat King is an example of a weapon of a niche done right. Even though its overall performance is low, it offers a playstyle that should never be encroached. And lastly, the Mida multi-tool. Mida kinda sucks, doesn't it? Mida is almost a one-for-one copy of itself from Destiny 1, but this weapon is the metaphorical canary in the cage. Mida is dead. Many legendaries are simply better versions of the Mida. For example, Traxapose, or however the hell you pronounce this thing, not only offers a strand damage synergy right out the get, but it also has a similar stat package and offers better perks, with the only major missing element here being Mida's radar. Mida offers no niche other than its ease of use and accessibility. Stats used to be considered a worthy enough of a reason to make a weapon exotic, evidenced by how many of these older catalysts are just pure stat increases. That is no longer the case. While stats seemingly have remained stagnant, their effective totals have increased over time as players have continued to focus farm for more and more optimal versions of weapons. Yet, stats are often the last item ever modified by Bungie, and thus some poorly statted and poorly optimized exotic weapons have done nothing but fall further behind. Let's look at Sweet Business. Business has always had extremely poor overall stats, and despite its update granting it explosive rounds, this hasn't kept it relevant outside more fun-focused loadouts and playstyles, mine included. Bungie is clearly still willing to update weapons, just look at Cerberus update in the final shape, but sadly these updates seem to always come off the backs of major updates and often underdeliver. Frankly, it's extremely disappointing that many exotic weapons have remained so below average for Destiny's entire lifespan. But Destiny is still around and likely will be for a little while longer. So we continue to hope for change. I would rather see old outdated exotics be given so much new life that they begin to experience a peak in the meta status for a little while, then continue to wallow in the pits and never be seen from again. Sweet Business is a slow, predictable weapon that performs poorly in PvP and barely adequately for mid-level AdClair in PvE. What if Business had the option for a second catalyst? The UI has space to support for this idea, and its current catalyst of flinch reduction is pathetic. Give Business's second catalyst the option of slight damage resistance when fully spun up, enough to justify its poor mobility, maybe also increase its base range too. Sturm is a very solid gun with a loadout price that is far too high. This weapon not only requires your kinetic slot, not only your exotic slot, but also your energy slot too if you ever want to see its true exotic perks. 3 different ideas. 1, give it Cascade Point, letting you stack up a ton of overcharged rounds and then dump them in a very short window. 2, let it have a reverse version of Harmony by granting other weapons damage buffs after kills with Sturm. And lastly, 3, allow non-Drang energy weapons to charge Sturm's overcharge shots, but slower, maybe like twice the amount of kills. Any one of those would help it carve out its niche more cleanly, as many other exotic hand cannons can do the Sturm's job, but frankly better. Huckleberry. I know many Huck apologists are out there, but for the people who love this weapon, why not use Osteostriga? It's the same idea with even better damage and AdClair. If you want this in PvP, many legendary SMGs perform just as well as Huckleberry minus the instant reload. Its exotic perks are juiced up versions of 3 legendary perks in one weapon: Subsistence, Onslaught, and Rampage. What if instead of it regaining ammo after kills, it returned all shots to the magazine on hit, every single one, allowing for better spin up and a different playstyle from Osteo that has more adaptability for bigger targets. Suros feels like a fine weapon, but so do most legendary autos. First, Let it switch its modes on the fly with the single press of a button without having to open up a menu. No idea why this hasn't been implemented yet, but that's neither here nor there. Second, make its healing on the bottom half of the magazine guaranteed. Again, no idea why this hasn't been implemented yet. Mida is not a multi-tool. Personally, I would love for this weapon to be fully craftable down to its RPM and weapon type. What you could potentially do is you could make Mida into a pulse rifle or into an auto rifle. What if you had a wealth of perks to choose from? Heck, even ignoring that, what if this weapon had 3 perks per slot like the legendary Kvastov, making it more like an actual multi-tool? More realistically, give the Mida the ability to stun champions, or at the very least update its catalyst to precision instrument instead of the extremely lackluster no distractions. Vigilant Swing with the catalyst has the exotic perk of having a 5-round burst and ensemble. After an ally dies, then you can actually access more. Having a niche requiring an ally to die is a terrible niche. Let it gain a very small bump in health if all 5 shots land instead of its healing on ally death. Or let it gain increased damage when allies take damage or die near you. Just anything better than its current niche. Bad Juju is yet again another Huckleberry situation. This weapon is effectively a juiced up Thresh, Subsistence, and Rampage that loses a fair portion of those when you actually do get your super finely charged. Not to mention, it has Hipfire Grip as one of its traits. It feels like a slap in the face. Either give it String of Curses X1 by default when your super is charged, or let it grant ability energy while your super is charged. Crimson. It's a weaker but kinetic hand cannon version of the Red Death. I think the Red Death is kicking its butt. While technically different, Red Death often just does what this is trying to do, but better and with solar weapon synergies. Swap its normal healing for restoration. This allows a kinetic weapon to supply an elemental verb, which is practically unheard of outside of like Rat King. This will still wander the shadow of the Red Death, but at least it can do what it's trying to do quicker and perhaps with a bit more of a selfish reward. Izanagi, oh boy, Still Hunt practically murdered this and then spit on its grave, didn't it? Lead from Gold would help its ammo economy, but that's a tad boring. What if landing crits with other weapons automatically loaded and granted honed edge to Izanagi's? Now it's more in flow for damage rotations and has a better time competing with Still Hunt. Hardlight, Borealis, and we can throw Dead Messenger in here too. Let powerful kills or multi-kills create an elemental pickup matching your damage type. It would also be neat if it could be changed to strand and stasis damage, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Brisk Runner is great if your enemies are firing arc. It really doesn't feel good to have your niche removed by your enemy just by them simply not giving you a source for your exotic perk. Updates its catalyst to also grant its superconductor perk while you're amplified. Now you at least have some control over its activation. If we want to take this a step further, we could also let its chain lightning be a jolt effect. That sounds a tad too strong. Teraba. Many forget this weapon even exists. This weapon is in desperate need of sustain and usability. First, let this weapon swap without losing its Ravenous Beast charge. It's been years, this is so out of date. Second, let it grant Cure or Radiant on kills while Ravenous Beast is active to keep it alive. Lord of Wolves. We suggested this in past videos, but let Lord of Wolves buff the fire rate of nearby shotguns, like how Galahorn works, but again, for shotguns. Alternatively, change this weapon from the ground up, making it a longer range projectile weapon like the Fallen use, that fires sort of like a spray pattern with a bit of a travel time. Well, you made it. Do you agree with me? Hate my guts or some confusing mix of the two? Let me know in the comments below. And subscribe if you think any of my ideas were worth a damn. I appreciate you. Bless your faces and deuces.